Good afternoon. My name is Maggie Fogarty. I'm the director of the New Hampshire program for the American Friends Service Committee. And I have the joy of being with two friends today for a conversation with Charlie Friou. So Charlie Friou is a Flatbush, New York born friend of the American Friends Service Committee for many years. He came to Quakerism in high school, inspired by the writings of John Woolman that set him on a path to social activism, a path that has taken him to urban communities in the United States, to Gaza in 1949, quite recently to the support committee for AFSC's New Hampshire program here in Concord. And so we're delighted to have some time with him today to explore some of his life experiences and be inspired by his journey. And leading us through that conversation will be another friend of AFSC, Candace Cole-McCrae, from Gonick Friends Meeting, also a member of AFSC's support committee with her PhD in psychology, education, and sociology. She brings wisdom and a seasoned perspective to storytelling and the human experience and to movements for social change. So thank you, Candace, for guiding us through this interview.
Thank you. And I love doing these, and I'm so interested in all your experience, Charlie. And our goal is to have this so that young people, especially everybody, but especially young people, can learn so much from your experience. So that's where we hope to go from it. So we're going to start with your experience on the Gaza Strip. Can you give us a brief picture of what life was like there with the Maghazi refugee camp when you were there in the Gaza Strip, and what you saw while you were there that maybe if you saw Quakers or anybody doing something that helped, what did you see? So could you give us a picture of that?
If you wanted to get a kind of a sense of Gaza, there were outside of Gaza a small band, I would say, of fertile agricultural land on the coastal plateau with reasonably decent groundwater and the need for a fair amount of artificial water distribution. So that Jaffa oranges, for example, which we all know or should have, and maybe there's not sold anymore in the market, I don't know, but Jaffa oranges came from the Jaffa area of Palestine. And in fact, one season there we had, the spring season there we had an overabundance of oranges because there was no place to ship them. And there were more oranges than any group of 200 or 300 people could possibly eat. Well, there had been several of these people had come into the area basically out of Europe to try to be of help where help was needed. And the refugee population had distributed in three directions, toward Egypt, toward Lebanon, and toward Syria, and toward Jordan, Syria. And the question of how to manage and care for this displaced population was a question, and Quakers were part of the dialogue and took on Gaza because of the probability that the Gaza situation would get resolved and people would be going back to their communities or to other areas to resettle. And some of our people had experience with that whole problem of resettlement. And we were also far more open to dealing with differences than, say, the Red Crescent Society or the Scandinavian Red Cross. And first, the refugees had squatted in a variety of places, and the first thing was to get them organized into some sense of settlements and with some sense of food. We put forward that the refugee food supply should support a certain caloric count, and that was actually the goal, became the goal, and actually became the standard, so that the effort also is trying nutrition, the perfect diet, but they carried with them everything they could possibly carry and left everything else behind.
What was the name of the camp, and where was it located in regards to commonly known locations?
The camp I was given responsibility for was the Gaza camp, which is basically a building, an area that had been some facet of British military operation, where once it was reverted to the nomadic tribal ownership, the sheikh of the tribe had razed all the buildings for resaleable building materials. And so the kind of a mishmash of a few residual buildings and all that, including a large kind of warehouse structure that became the centerfold of the distribution center for 10,000 people in food.
Were all the volunteers friends / Quakers?
The American Friends Service Committee was early on in the presence of what had happened, and realized it was a long-term resettlement issue. They had worked extensively in Europe with displaced populations, and so several of them had experience there, and so they recognized they could not manage more than part of it, and out of that emerged the idea of the American Red Cross in one area, or rather the Egyptian Red Crescent Society in one area, and the Scandinavian Red Cross in the other area. So the Quakers took Gaza on the presumption that there would be soon a peace settlement, and with the peace settlement, Gaza would be reattached to the body of what is now Israel, and that they, having worked with particularly the issues of migrants out of Hitler's Germany in New York, that they would have a comfortable relationship in either place.
So other than having that experience with resettlement post-World War II in Europe, what were some of the other backgrounds? You were a fledgling minister and doing your missionary work. What about others?
Well, really what had happened was I had become convinced of, based upon John Woolman's experiences, that was the kind of direction I wanted to go. And when I got to Bard, I was told that the social work aspect was not what social work was about in those days. And so I kind of cast my bread on wider waters. And when I finished seminary, I decided I would first do some volunteer work. And I went to Philadelphia and tied into the AFSC program with willingness to go to Gaza, and spent 2 weeks on a Dutch freighter to get to Egypt, and then supposedly 2 or 3 days in Egypt, but it was only overnight until I was in a plane into the United Nations, actually a U.S. Air Force plane that was a designated carrier for the UN and properly decorated with United Nations on the wings and such. That was connecting Egypt with Lebanon on a kind of daily flight.
And others, did they have similar backgrounds, social work, ministry, or just in general, just volunteering as friends?
Some of them had been involved in European issues of resettlement.
Right, but besides those, because you've mentioned those, but anything else that stood out in terms of background?
A very broad reach, basically of Quaker commitment, and some of them had, a handful had been in other involvements there in the Middle East.
Okay. So when I did the math, you were 23 when you went to Gaza, and what was the average age of the other Friends volunteers? Were they all similar age group, or?
I was one of the younger. There was one, Evan Jones, was younger, and he had been from the British West. British West Indies, I believe, and had gone to Quaker colleges in Pennsylvania, or a Pennsylvania college.
Now, of this group of volunteers, who ended up heading up the activities on your particular site?
I was the Quaker in charge of the Benghazi camp. There were about 3,000 people in the camp when I arrived. The person who had been there was going home, and so I became very quickly the Quaker in charge of that camp. And then the Egyptian government had decided they could not support the refugees who had landed in Egypt from Palestine, crossing the desert, and had moved them to a former British camp out in the desert. And essentially the Quaker body in Gaza got advised that they would be returned to Palestine, and most of them then were assigned to the Benghazi camp, where we had room for constructing an entire, for 7,000 people.
So you grew from 3,000 to 7,000 when the Egyptians said that you got to go.
Correct.
There. Okay, so how did you manage to find adequate food supplies for this size of a camp?
Well, by then we were basically dealing with contributed goods from surplus agricultural materials in the U.S. and anything else that could be found.
That's why all the oranges all of a sudden.
Well, the oranges were growing in Gaza, as were date palms, dates.
So you mentioned with the nutrition that it became that the caloric program that you put together became sort of the nutritional guidelines. Was that just for the camp or going forward, like the food triangle that we have?
Well, we were trying to provide balanced diet. Now, we were dependent upon what anybody happened to have contributed, that is, the different countries and different states and so forth. We had canned haddock with people who, first of all, they didn't have can openers, and then had never seen canned fish, and the whole issue was, how do you show them what this stuff is and what you do with it? And I remember working with my associate and my chief clerk in putting together a translation of what was canned haddock, and we posted them in all of the little coffee shops that had developed along this was an old British military camp where there was still some residual foundations and buildings and so on. And so a number of enterprising folks had developed coffee shop where people could have their traditional Arabian coffee and there was nothing else to do anyway but sit and talk. And so I'd post these notices where the men would be able to read in Arabic, or at least those that could read Arabic could read to others what this stuff was, and then they could tell their wives what it was and how to use it.
Was there a long-term plan beyond the contributions put in place? Any agricultural direction to?
At that time, the issue was initially when would there be a settlement and potentially a return and reestablishment of residential patterns. That, of course, essentially never happened.
Did anybody ever try, or was there ever any interference with what you're trying to do for the refugees? Anyone trying to ever try to stop you from assisting?
No, I think there was Israel was trying to establish itself as a viable Zionist-oriented country, and there's probably little interest there in any additional Arabs returning.
But they never tried to stop unless people tried to go back. I mean, I know that happened in more recent history,
There was
but I don't know about initially.
There was a military line between us. We had a group of people who would actually plant gardens in Israel and then come back into the camp. And one day the Israelis decided they didn't like that, and they started presumably shooting into the ground to scare them away. And I know one woman got shot and I remember taking a ride with the UN and Israeli Arab representatives along the border.
To try to smooth things
Where
over.
there was basically a trail, a two-track trail, where the UN components had been monitoring the border. And where did this and all that happen? Which side of the line?
So you never felt there was any danger in the refugee camp itself, as long as you.
I never felt personal danger, no, nor even riding in the three-vehicle Israeli, Palestinian, or Egyptian UN group that went down the border to establish on which side of the border what had happened when there had been an incident there.
So were there ever any difficulties with between the volunteers and the refugees themselves, or was that a very fluent, open?
No, there was a very positive relationship in terms of interaction. I mean, I had a Palestinian, an educated Palestinian Arab who, after the UN or the Quaker group left and it became a UN project, started the school system that I guess is what now exists in Gaza. He and a chief clerk who is also bilingual.
Amazing.
And I rearranged the pecking order in a sense, as long as one of them was available to me for translation.
So I recall you telling a story about coming back to camp and having a big sort of semi-upset crowd to greet you. I think after a rain.
The volunteer staff with the Quaker Association all lived in Gaza. 3 different houses that were in the same, had been the neighborhood where the British military used to live.
Gaza Center, I think it's Gaza City.
Kind of up toward the beach, not in the center of the city, but. And we would drive then in the mornings to our camp locations within the strip. I'd start out from Gaza with an old surplus military Jeep painted blue, and along the line pick up different people that worked on my staff that were more bilingual and more literate. And then, finding with a rather overloaded Jeep arrive at the camp, and I arrived the night before. It had been a wretched night with snow and rain, and arrived at the camp, and there was a big crowd outside this little building we used as an office, maybe like 30 by 30, that had 2 rooms, and so I said to my camp assistant, my Khalil Uwadai, keep them at the door. I'm going to go in and so I went in, and this whole crowd of people crowded around the door, And I went through the building and went out a window and headed down toward where the problem was. And they started running after me. And then when they realized what I was doing, they all started laughing.
What were you doing?
Because I was heading, they could tell I was heading down to see where the tent locations had been flooded out by the rain. And then I was able to figure out what we could do about it in terms of either relocating the camps or providing drainage or whatever. And so then we could work that out, and we did. And we had a crew of about a dozen refugees hired, paid a nominal sum, as to work on setting up the relocated camp.
Very good. Is there anything else you want to add about Gaza that I have not asked you questions about?
Well, there was a movie theater.
In the camp?
No, in Gaza. And they had a generator that produced enough power so they could show movies. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Arab culture was kind of, men could go to the movies, but the women kind of left out. And we Quakers were not going to leave out our women. Mm-hmm. And so they were allowed to sit in that corner with us. When we'd go to these old films that were being shown in Gaza Theater. At that time, Gaza did not have electric power throughout. Some occasional people had generators, but not too many.
So were the refugees able to go in and out of Gaza city, or were they supposed to stay in their camp area? Any restrictions?
There was reasonably free movement along the coastal line, approximately 10 miles of the area was about 3 miles wide and about 10 miles long. There was a checkpoint at the Wadi Gaza, which is basically a mountain stream coming down across to the ocean. And after a rainstorm, for example, you might find that you're driving through 6 or 8 inches of water, or barely enough to miss the engine of the Jeep or the other vehicle. And it wasn't uncommon to have people there, if there had been rain. There wasn't that much of it, but when there was, to the word zug, push. And whomever happened to be not the driver might land in the water up to their, up over their shoes anyway, pushing whatever vehicle they happened to be trying to ride in. Didn't happen very often.
But sometimes.
But it did happen.
So, specific to your experience, since you had chosen to do this before going on into a church setting, how do you feel this experience impacted your forward movement in your life?
Well, my father didn't think I should do this at all. And many years later, he said it was probably the best thing I ever did. And I suspect that being basically suddenly in an environment where you are making some pretty significant decisions, probably, you might say, grew up despite the fact I was through college and 3 years of professional school.